Around 1200 BC, in the span of a few decades, nearly every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean fell apart at roughly the same time. The Mycenaeans, the Minoans, the Hittite Empire, one of the great superpowers of the ancient world, ruling a territory that once rivaled Egypt itself. Cities burned, trade routes that had connected the region for centuries went completely silent. For over 100 years, historians have argued about why. Yesterday, a team of climate scientists in Sweden published an answer that nobody had quite pieced together before. And it wasn't one single culprit at all. It was terrible timing. The late Bronze Age, in the centuries leading up to this collapse, wasn't a scattered patchwork of isolated kingdoms. It was the most interconnected the ancient world had ever been. A genuine international system, with Egyptian grain, Cypriot copper, and Levantan tin moving along shipping routes that stitched together an entire regional economy. One where a shortage in one kingdom could ripple straight into another hundreds of miles away. Historians and archaeologists have debated the cause of its sudden unraveling for well over a century. Invasions by mysterious raiders known as the Sea Peoples. Internal revolts among an oppressed peasantry, earthquakes, or drought. Severe drought in particular has shown up again and again in tree rings. Cave formations and lake sediment cores pulled from across the region. Archaeologists have even recovered desperate letters from this exact period. Hittite officials writing to Egypt, pleading for emergency grain shipments as their own harvests failed, and a final unsent letter found at the port city of Ugarit, warning of enemy ships closing in. Right before the city itself was burned and never resettled again. What nobody had fully explained was why that specific drought, at that specific moment, turned out to be so much worse than the many droughts that came both before and after it. In a region that has always dealt with periodic dry spells throughout its entire history. That's the question a team led by Katherine, a doctoral researcher in the Department of Physical Geography at Stockholm University, working alongside Professor Qiong Zhang, set out to answer. Rather than digging for yet another physical trace of ancient drought in the ground, the team built a detailed climate model called Earth, and used it to reconstruct how the Mediterranean's climate actually evolved over the past 0 years, layer by layer, mechanism by mechanism. Instead of just cataloging where and when the dry spells happened to show up in the geological record. What they found was that the region had been on a slow, multi-thousand-year drying trend the entire time, driven by gradual, predictable shifts in Earth's own orbit around the Sun. The kind of change that plays out over millennia. Far too slow for any single civilization to ever notice happening around them in a single lifetime. On its own, that gradual trend wouldn't have been nearly severe enough to trigger a regional collapse. Civilizations had survived plenty of dry centuries before this one. But layered directly on top of that slow trend, the model revealed something else entirely. Shorter-term fluctuations in Atlantic Ocean circulation and atmospheric patterns. Changes that unfold over years or decades rather than millennia. Capable of independently weakening the monsoons that carried moisture up from Africa and disrupting rainfall patterns across the wider Mediterranean basin. Here's the part that finally explains the mystery. Around 1200 BC, both of these processes, the slow orbital drying trend and the faster Atlantic-driven fluctuations, happened to peak at almost exactly the same time. Neither factor alone was unprecedented. The region had survived long-term drying before. It had weathered shorter climate swings before, too, on their own, without any civilization-ending consequences. What made this particular moment different wasn't the presence of any single extreme event nobody had ever seen. It was the coincidence of multiple independent climate cycles, operating on completely different timescales, all landing in the exact same unlucky window at once. Power described the core finding directly, rather than being caused by one single climatic event. The most extreme droughts emerged specifically when natural climate cycles operating over different timescales lined up together. And that overlap helps explain why the drought tied to the late Bronze Age collapse hit as hard as it did. It's less a story about one uniquely terrible year, and more a story about several separate systems, none of them individually catastrophic on their own, all quietly synchronizing at the worst possible moment in history. This detail matters enormously for how we should think about complex, interconnected societies generally, not only the Bronze Age. A network as tightly linked as the late Bronze Age's international trade system, where grain shortages in one region could cascade into shortages of finished bronze weapons and tools somewhere else entirely, doesn't necessarily need one single catastrophic failure to unravel completely. It just needs multiple separate pressures to arrive at once, stacking faster than a system built around stability can actually absorb them. Researchers studying this same period have already drawn direct comparisons to recent, very real modern disruptions. The way the COVID-19 pandemic exposed how brittle global supply chains actually were underneath their efficient surface. The way a single container ship wedged sideways in the Suez Canal briefly stalled a meaningful share of world trade for days. And the way one regional conflict disrupting Ukrainian wheat exports rippled into food security concerns on the other side of the planet almost immediately. None of those individual events caused a civilizational collapse on their own. The lesson researchers keep returning to is that interconnection cuts both ways. The same tight links that spread prosperity efficiently in stable times can just as efficiently spread failure once several pressures start compounding together at once. The Stockholm team was careful to frame their findings around exactly that kind of forward-looking relevance, rather than treating this purely as a historical curiosity. Understanding precisely how independent climate cycles can stack together to produce extreme, compounding droughts doesn't just explain a 200-year-old mystery sitting in tree rings and cave sediment. It gives researchers today a clearer, physically grounded framework for anticipating how similar compounding droughts might form in a warming world. One where several distinct climate systems are already shifting at the same time, rather than one at a time the way earlier, simpler models often assumed. There's a broader debate among historians about how total this collapse actually was. Some late Bronze Age powers like Assyria and Egypt weakened significantly but survived in some reduced form. Others, like the Hittite Empire, vanished from the historical record almost entirely. Its capital at Hadusa abandoned and largely forgotten for thousands of years until archaeologists rediscovered its ruins. The Mycenaean palace at Pylos in southern Greece burned so completely that the fire itself accidentally preserved the clay administrative tablets inside it, baking them hard enough to survive more than 3,000 years, a final, ordinary bureaucratic record of a government that had no idea it was about to disappear entirely, still logging routine shipments and rations right up until the end. What united nearly all of these places wasn't total destruction happening everywhere in exactly the same way, but a shared vulnerability to the exact same overlapping pressures, hitting an entire interconnected system within the same narrow window of years. For more than a century, the fall of the late Bronze Age's great powers has been treated as one of history's most stubborn unsolved mysteries, a graveyard of competing theories that never quite added up to a single complete explanation on their own. The answer, it turns out, was never going to be found by identifying the one single worst culprit. It was sitting quietly in the overlap between several separate, individually survivable problems arriving together at exactly the wrong moment, in a world that had never once had to withstand more than one of them at the same time before. The unwritten record, some of history's biggest stories were never written down at all. Subscribe and check out the rest of the channel, new lost chapters of history, going up every day.